study of human sexuality would be complete without discussing sexual offending, which includes full-blown rape as well as many other types of sexual aggression. Carroll defines sexual aggression as any type of sexual conduct or behavior that occurs without the consent of the recipient of the unwanted sexual activity. According to Carroll, rapists are primarily young single men between 15 and 30. This shows that it is most often a young offender who commits sexual assault, and we will look at the demographic in particular, including what leads to these acts, recidivism rates for young offenders, and current treatment options. According to researchers, the underlying causes of sexual offending vary, but there are several common denominators in the lives of offenders. Studies reveal that 25 to 50% of sex offenders report themselves were sexually abused, usually as children or teens, a number that may or may not be close to the actuality due to self-reporting disparities where they believe that a number of those abused will never reveal that information. Another commonality is the background of offenders is growing up in a home with little affection or bonding between members, where acquiring positive self-esteem was not an important factor in their early lives. While abuse is a common denominator, in an article by Farley, Pegram, and Reiser, they state it is important to note that many of these offenders do not have a history of abuse, and a majority of victims of abuse do not go on to sexually offend themselves. Some other common threads in the background of those who sexually offend are lower than normal social skill abilities, learning disabilities, and in more than a few cases, psychopathology. It is interesting to note that both juvenile sex offenders as well as non-sexual offenders share most of these traits. In an article by Bordwin and Latorno, they say predictors and correlates of juvenile sexual offending behavior parallel those of non-sexually delinquent youth and occur across the ecological systems in which youths are naturally embedded. This article then goes on to say that treatment modalities for youthful sexual offenders should be similar to those for non-sexual offenders. These authors believe that these treatments would be more helpful in dealing with these youth than current treatments that are modeled off of adult sexual offender treatments, whose effectiveness in juveniles has never been proven. While most juvenile sex offenders do not reoffend as adults, those who do may become predatory, and their acts may become more serious and more violent as they age, which shows that it is imperative that the offenders are reached as youth, where it has been shown that treatment is much more effective than with adult offenders. Some of the differences between juvenile and adult sexual offenders are the severity of the act as well as the frequency of offending. There is some research that supports that young offenders whose acts include minor deviant behaviors such as voyeurism or exhibitionism may become more hardcore offenders later in life if left unchecked. However, to assume that a youthful offender will become an adult offender and treat them as though it's a reality may result in unwanted issues for the youth. On the other hand, if left untreated, they may indeed proceed to become adult offenders, so a middle ground must be reached in the treatment of these young offenders. This same article addresses the current treatment practices, which for the most part are based on cognitive behavioral therapies, or CBTs, that include anti-recidivistic or relapse prevention elements. They claim that there is no data that shows this type of intervention is effective with youthful sex offenders, and believe that it may be deleterious to their future activities. Most offenders receiving this type of therapy are in facilities that house youthful offenders, and as with all programs that group offenders together, both sexual and non-sexual, there are serious drawbacks to this system, mainly that offenders may become worse when surrounded with other offending youth. Researchers believe the biggest problem with CBT is that it does not address the environmental and family issues that may be involved in the background of the offender, and therefore may leave core issues unresolved in the life of the offender, which could lead to reoffending behaviors. Recidivism is the rate at which offenders who have been caught and treated in some method by the justice system are caught reoffending. As an article by Lovanov-Rostovsky reminds us, these numbers do not include any of the substantial number of sexual offenses that do not come to the attention of criminal or juvenile justice authorities. Sexual crime victims have historically failed to report many of the offenses against them, which will always be a factor in looking at recidivism rates for these offenders. Some research studies in this area have attempted to use self-reporting techniques to gather data, but again, there are obvious issues with this style of research, as it requires that offenders will admit to reoffending, which they may or may not do. In the National Youth Survey, which followed a large group of children and teens beginning in 1976 and is followed up on still, the findings regarding adolescent sex assaults were interesting, showing that overall 3% of respondents revealed having committed a sexual assault. In this study, assaults were broken down into minor and major assaults, minor being things like groping or exhibitionism, while major included rape and other severe types of assault. One of the more interesting findings of this study was that only 3% of minor offenders and 10% of major offenders report being caught by the justice system. This shows the wide gap between reported and unreported cases, as well as cases that were reported but the perpetrator was never caught. Sexual assaults are tough cases for police and prosecutors, as most assaults take place where the victim and perpetrator are the only witnesses to a private interaction. It also fails to address how intervention may have affected these children, if indeed they had been adjudicated by the justice system for their acts. Some of the findings of this study supported other studies that found that youthful sex offenders were more likely to reoffend with a non-sexual offense than they were to reoffend with a sexual offense. There are some treatments of youthful offenders that have shown promise with this group. These are listed as functional family therapy, multidimensional treatment, foster care, and multisystemic therapy. MST shows the best outcomes in most studies. It is just what the name implies, multi-dimensional treatment therapy that addresses the various systems in the life of the offender and how each of these affect the behavior and their aspects of the offenders in life. Sexual assault is an age-old problem, and the Bible spoke of it several times in the Old Testament, where the most well-known story of rape is that of Tamar, the daughter of King David, whose half-brother Ammon raped her and was later killed by another brother, Absalom, for the offense. The New Testament, while not dealing with rape in particular, has many admonitions against sexual sin, which obviously sexual assault would be part of. The act of sexual assault is one of both physical and emotional dominance over the victim, which is in obvious contradiction to the edicts of our Lord to treat each other with kindness and respect. While youthful offenders account for the majority of sexual assaults, research is promising that these young offenders may more easily be successfully treated and move into adulthood without reoffending. The issue of sexual offending by both adults and youth is a serious problem in our society. It has been through the ages before us. There is more promise now than there ever has been for the rehabilitation, especially of youthful offenders, thanks to research that has been and is being conducted into best practice treatments for them. While there will probably never be a time where there are no sexual assaults, we need to constantly seek new therapies and continually assess current treatments to decrease the repeated offenses of first offenders that do come in contact with the criminal justice system.